Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us today for the Division 45 webinar on radical research. We've got an amazing group of panelists who are going to talk to us about the radical research that they're doing. Just a couple reminders before we get started that this webinar is being recorded, and so if you ask questions, please know that it will be shared, your image or your voice or your questions will be shared publicly. We'll be putting it out on the listserv afterwards and sharing it on social media to try to spread the radical research knowledge. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get started by introducing our panelists, and then we'll hear from Dr. Neville for a few minutes and get into these amazing presentations. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Melanie Domenech Rodriguez, who is a professor of psychology at Utah State University. She's mentored 9 undergraduate honors theses, 13 master's theses, and 18 doctoral dissertations to completion. Melanie's research focuses on cultural adaptations of evidence-based interventions, cultural competence, and parenting. In that context, she has culturally adapted Generation PMTO parenting interventions for Latinxes in the US and Mexico, as well as developed a Generation PMTO program for Latinx parents of preschoolers called Padres Preparados. Melanie is past president of the National Latinx Psychological Association and current president of PsyChi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. On the Utah State University campus, she serves as the chair of the IRB. She's also a proud ally on campus and participates in community events ranging from peaceable assemblies to proactive community education in the service of advancing social justice. Melanie is a licensed psychologist. She obtained her doctoral degree at Colorado State University in 1999. There she trained at the Tri-Ethnic Center for Prevention Research, and she also completed a postdoc fellowship with the Family Research Consortium at the University of Washington. Melanie was born and raised in Puerto Rico and currently lives in Logan, Utah. We are so happy to have her with us today. After she speaks, we'll hear from Dr. Candace Harguns, who earned her PhD from the University of Georgia in 2015. She directs the RISE Squared research team, which is an acronym for both relationships, intimacy, and sexual enrichment, as well as race, intersectionality, and social justice engagement. And so they study sex, social justice, and leadership, all with a love ethic. Recent projects have included sexual narratives of Black students and healing racial trauma, which you'll get to hear a bit about today. And her work has been featured in various media, including the Huffington Post. She teaches diagnosis, ethics, social justice consultation, and practicum. And she's a licensed psychologist specializing in sex therapy and healing racial trauma. Candace has served as a leader in the American Psychological Association, the American Psychological Association of Graduate Students, and the Society of Counseling Psychology. She is an APA Minority Fellow. We look forward to hearing from her today. And she'll be followed by Dr. Matthew Miller, who is an associate professor and co-director of training of the Counseling Psychology program at the University of Maryland. He's an associate editor for the Journal of Counseling Psychology and is on the editorial boards of Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, Measurement and Evaluation in Counseling and Development, and Asian American Journal of Psychology. His research examines the cultural and racial experiences of racially diverse populations, the psychology of social justice engagement, the career development of diverse populations, and the measurement of multicultural psychological constructs. He is also developing and testing evidence-based, culturally responsive, and ecologically valid first-person narrative mental health video interventions. And so we are so lucky to hear about that project today. And then finally, Dr. Karen Tsuyamoto will close us out, and she is a professor of psychology and Asian American studies and the director of Transnational Cultural and Community Studies graduate program at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her teaching, research, and consultations focus on research on understanding the effects of race and racism on mental health and identity, examining the effects of participating in activism and resistance, and promoting the integration of cultural responsiveness and racial social justice in education and psychological practice, training, and research. Dr. Tsuyamoto is a past president of the National Asian American Psychological Association, AAPA, and recently served as their delegate to APA's Council of Representatives. In 2013, she was recognized as a White House Champion of Change, Asian American Pacific Islander woman, received the AAPA's Distinguished Contributions Award. She is currently the chair of the APA task force, developing the new guidelines for race and ethnicity in psychology. And so, as you can see, today is jam-packed with heavy hitters who are doing some really radical research. And so before we get into their work, let's hear from Dr. Neville about her vision of radical healing and how we got to this webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Della, for the wonderful introductions to folks. I'm going to keep my comments fairly short. I just really want to welcome folks to the APA Division 45, our last webinar. As folks may or may not know, I'm ending my president as AP Division 45. Part of my initiative was around promoting healing through social justice in communities of color. I really wanted to provide space for us to think about and about ways in which our communities are most affected by racial trauma and its intersections with other forms of trauma, focusing on our resiliency and our strengths. I'm thrilled to have the Dream Team work with me, particularly Della Mosley and Grace Chin, who are the ones who coordinated this particular webinar, but also Doctors Brianna French, Nayeli Chavez, Hector Adamas, and Gioni Lewis. They've just done an amazing job of bringing this vision to fruition and articulating some clear paths of moving forward. One of the things is that they took the initiative on developing a psychological framework for radical healing, which will appear in the Counseling Psychologists next month. So please be on the lookout for that. As some folks know, this is the third in our webinar, or the fourth in our series, dealing with radical healing and unpacking that, what it means. I can think of no better way to end this webinar series than the current series that is dealing with radical research. Our first series were stimulating and important in terms of defining it, looking at what students are experiencing, thinking about practice, and now we're bringing it into the research arena. I feel as though that Division 45 has super friends in the 4 people that are presenting. I really want to take time to personally thank Dr. Dominique Rodriguez, Dr. Hargens, Dr. Miller, and Dr. Suyumoto. I know each of them, and I know we are in for a real treat. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen. And we will go ahead and turn it over to you, Melanie.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I will start my timer so I can be respectful and because I want to hear everybody else's presentations. This is a bit of a fluid journey through a program of research in cultural adaptation and Latinx mental health, which I can now, I think, fairly comfortably call radical. I didn't know what I was doing for the first 10 years of my career, which apparently is fairly normative, but was very excited when I read the description of radical healing as grounded in collectivism and conceptualized as encompassing critical consciousness, strength, hope, and cultural authenticity as a means to resist oppression and strive for liberation. This is French et al. I assume this is the article that's coming out in 2018, so I have a note to put a alarm on that so I can read it as soon as it comes out. And really a lot of the work that I have done from day one has really been focused on improving Latinx mental health, particularly Latinx families' mental health, with the very clear understanding that families with structures create the conditions for oppression, and that conducting sound research could be a really good vehicle for providing a different context and providing resources for liberation for these families. And so hopefully I will show this here today, and hopefully you will have questions, and hopefully you'll have recommendations for how I can do better, because I think there's always space. I want to bring your attention to the book on the right, Diffusion of Innovations by Everett Rogers, because before I was a psychologist, I actually was in a master's program in technical journalism. And the professor that I expected to have the least influence in me turned out to have an incredibly profound influence in shaping my thinking. And it was a lot through exposing me to this book and then making the time to discuss it with me. And Rogers in this book discusses how people adopt new technologies, which sounds a little bit off from parenting interventions, but hang with me, because he was talking about technologies that range anywhere from jugs in remote villages to carry potable drinking water, all the way to the internet, right? So the word technology is very broad. But the thing that Rogers did for me that ignited my imagination was talk about this pro-innovation bias and how we as a society, especially here in the Western world, always see innovation as positive. And then in the process of jamming our innovations down other people's throats, we don't take their beliefs, values, and practices into account. And he talks about a particular example of in Egypt, the Ministry of Health built a system to deliver pure chlorinated water to villages in remote areas near the Nile. And it turned out people didn't like the taste of the water and didn't drink it. And rather than point to the people as possessing some sort of deficiency that led to their own demise, Rogers pointed to the failure of the people bringing the innovation and to connect with these folks in communities to understand their wants and needs and bring something that would be useful. And I have to say, at that point in my career, I had not read anything like that, and it blew my mind, and it shaped what I did, well, to this day. Actually, I still have my copy of Rogers' book, and I pull it out every now and then and re-review. So when I went into my doctoral program, I met this amazing woman, Marian Forgach, who developed Parenting Through Change, and I said, I want to work with Latinx families. And she said, well, I have no idea how to do that. I'm just a white lady working with white people, but I have this intervention, and if it's useful to you, if you see anything in there that would be useful to you, and you know how to work with Latinx families, then by all means do so. And this person is profoundly embedded in my life to this day. So in order to get the work started, I didn't know where to start. I didn't have access to this literature 20 years ago when my doctoral training ended. We were not being trained in CBPR. We were not being trained in colonial mentality and internalized depression and, right? So I basically knew in my heart that I needed to take a different approach, and I didn't know what that was, but I had Rogers' book and I had my life experiences. And so I built a model, which is this cultural adaptation process model. And you can see that it borrows from Rogers' language in terms of change agents and opinion leaders. And I had these amazing colleagues that gave me an opportunity to write up what seemed like very crazy ideas at the time. And, advance them for publication. Elizabeth Wheeling is an amazing scholar. If you haven't read her work, I strongly encourage you to do that. And if you do work in cultural adaptations, you're probably very familiar with Guillermo Bernal's model. He's a dear colleague and a close collaborator. And his model was embedded in our cultural adaptation process model because Bernal looked at cultural adaptations from the standpoint of the treatment manual itself and the clinical encounter. And I took a step back to look at the bigger picture. How do we even begin to think about what a manual needs? How do we begin to think about this problem not as in a pathology, but this thing that we want to do, and do it in the best possible way. So I was very fortunate to immediately connect with all these beautiful people, and you can see me there many, many years ago. Once we developed the model and I had the Parenting Through Change manual because Marian was generous enough to share it, we started doing a ton of research, and some of our very basic questions were, in essence, what is parenting? What is important in parenting to Latinx parents? What is important about shaping their children's futures? Can we do behavioral observations with Latinx families, especially given the history of trauma and all of the problems with immigration? Can we do this? And the answer was yes and no. And so we learned about how parents gave consejos to their kids and how this very specific parenting practice was both an opportunity and a challenge. We learned about the incredible levels of warmth in Latinx families and that we needed to really look at different ways of measuring that. We learned about fathers and the important role that they play. Fathers have been omitted from the parenting literature a lot. and their importance, not just because, of course, they're parents and they are an important part of the family nucleus, but because their experiences in this country and their level of acculturation actually proceeds at a different rate from mothers. And that impacts the family in different ways, and it impacts parenting practices. We observed all of that. We saw that our behavioral observations were very much feasible. In fact, in some instances, parents considered them therapeutic. I had to twice give money back. Parents were trying to give me their payment back because they felt like by coming in and participating in this family interaction, they had gained so much, they didn't feel like they could take the money that we were giving them for payment in this research. So we knew we were doing something right. We knew we were connecting with the community, and then we proceeded with the RCT. And I will keep it short, but basically parents really came to the groups, they enjoyed them, and one really well-placed ICE raid in the middle of the RCT kind of blew everything up. But as my dear colleague, Ruben Parra Cardona would say, we get tired, but we don't give up. And so we kept going, and we learned about different parenting styles. We documented the existence of a protective parenting style in Latinx families that doesn't map on to the parenting styles that have been established in the literature, where warmth is high, and demandingness is also high, and autonomy granting is low. It's actually a pretty protected cocoon, if you will. And then the really incredible thing, and as we talk about sort of radical research, to me this is kind of the most radical piece, is that the networks of scholars that came together to do this work grew. So I met Ruben when he was a graduate student at a different university, and ultimately we collaborated to deliver another version of CAPAS in Michigan. And so he looked at a CAPAS that was straight up how I had adapted it, and then an enhanced version that included sessions on biculturalism and immigration. And we saw changes. We saw positive changes in families. And then we went and did it in Mexico. And my colleagues there are Ana Bauman, a former graduate student of mine, and Nancy Amador Buenabad, who's my colleague in Mexico City. And we did it there with 202 families. And we see changes in parenting practices, and we see impact to child outcomes. And so through creating a community of scholars that were collaborative and growth-oriented and courageous enough to give feedback and courageous enough to give support and to be happy for each other for our successes, we have built a knowledge base that is critical, I think, to Latinx families in the United States and in Mexico and Puerto Rico. I later was able to develop a program called Padres Preparados, in which, again, for parents of preschoolers, one of the things that we learned in those early focus groups was that one of parents' primary goals was for their children to be well educated. And so we targeted that by focusing on a program that would increase preschoolers' ability to engage in academic achievement. And in that process, we had babies, and we collaborated using whatever technologies we had on hand, because ultimately, I think following Ignacio Martín Barós' guidance, a revolution is not a simple period of facing an inappropriate social order, but it is a process through which you change radically the social order. And I think I have been incredibly fortunate to do that with wonderful, wonderful people. So I look forward to hearing the other presenters and asking any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was awesome. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about your work. And so we're going to go on to Candace. And so if people have questions specific to Melanie, you can feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to them and be taking note of them and get to them later. And Candace, if you want to go ahead and start, that'd be great.
Hey, y'all. So I'm trying to make sure I can see my slides. And okay, there we go. So can everybody hear me? All right. I just appreciate being on this webinar with some people who are rock stars to me in psychology. It's just a humbling experience and one I'm really grateful for. And I love that as people are talking, I'm already seeing overlap. And I think the radical research that we're doing is going to have those things in some positive ways and some ways that challenge us, but that we continue to overcome. So my study is looking at healing racial trauma as radical research. And what I like about this opportunity, I will call it, is that it is one where I get to push myself as a qualitative researcher to do something very, very new for me. So I primarily do qualitative methods, and this is my first experimental study. And that is both frightening and invigorating at the same time. I'm getting a frozen screen signal, so hold on one second. Let's try it again. Okay, so in 2016, I created the Black Lives Matter Meditation for Healing Racial Trauma. And that meditation was developed really out of the need for a summer's worth of onslaught of murdering of Black people, predominantly unarmed Black people. And as a approaching second year assistant professor, I was exhausted. I was concerned. I felt like I had a skill set that could be useful. And so I was thinking about how I needed to do that, what I needed to do to contribute my skills to that. So it's a 17-minute guided meditation, and we use mindfulness, meta, and culturally relevant affirmations. And to date, it's been used in university counseling centers, therapy practices, social justice workshops nationally. And mostly it's received positive feedback. I did get some trolling on my social media because people gonna peep, but it needs empirical testing to see what the real value of it has been for people. So I'm coming with the conceptualization of racial trauma through Carter and Clark Anderson, Clark and Williams's lens, that race-based stress is it's the psychological and emotional injury that's pathological that comes from the onslaught of racism that we experience in many forms. And race-based stress plus limited coping strategies can lead to racial trauma. So when I was thinking about what area could I intervene on the individual level, I was thinking about coping strategies. And when I think about what area I can intervene on the systemic level, it's anti-racism work. So I see that as the next step in this process. But I had to test out this theory with myself first because I didn't want to subject participants to what could be additional trauma. And also, I wanted to see whether or not there was a biometric effect of hearing or experiencing racism. So you'll see this when I was developing the pilot for this study, which we're doing now. I found a 5-minute clip of racist stimulus. And basically, it's a white woman who is using every stereotype you can think of about racism. I don't know if anybody has heard this before because it was on the national news, but she basically called and left a message for a professor at the University of Maryland. And it was an extensive, long message, and it was just stereotype after stereotype, racist epithet after racist slang. And it went on for about 9 minutes, and I cut the clip to 5. And so here you can see, you guys remember that commercial from the 90s where it's like, this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs. Well, you can see my heart rate variability, and then you can see my heart rate variability on racism. So heart rate variability is this biometric indicator where it basically suggests that you are psychologically and physiologically adapting well to stress. Higher heart rate variability will show you a larger range in the amount of your heartbeat, your beats per minute. So on the left side, you guys will see my total power is 1388, whereas on the right side, it's 464. And that's me just being in silence versus me listening to the racist stimulus. So seeing those results, decided to move forward with the study because it was giving me some indication that racism has a biometric effect. And the research supports this, but I wanted to kind of see it on my own. I'm getting another symbol for my screen isn't moving. Hold on one second. So why intervention research? One, because evidence on what race-based stress and racial trauma are established, but interventions exist with limited empirical support. So I wanted to design and share an intervention to determine what the effect actually was, and then how it could be used and improved. And that's why we're using both a qualitative and quantitative approach to this study. I apologize, you guys, for all of the hiccups in this. I'm not sure what's going on with my PowerPoint, but it doesn't want to let me be great today. So the heart-based biometrics, after a year-long practicum at Emory University's Counseling Center, I developed a knowledge of and skill in mind-body interventions for reducing stress that included meditation, that included biofeedback, and one of the specific biometrics was heart rate variability. So that's known to show what your psychological and physiological wellness are. Higher HRV represents a better ability to cope. So Black people have been found in some of the research to have higher rates of HRV than other racial groups, but the examination of race-based stress has shown to have long-ranging impact on our health overall. There we go. So the point of the study is to examine how being exposed to racism impacts the qualitative reported and biometrically measured stress levels of Black students. And it also seeks to ground definitions and experiences of racial trauma in the voice of participants. I'm going to pause. I'm going to try to cut my PowerPoint off and then start it again to see if something is going on with that. Okay, so we're using a random assignment of a purposeful sample of Black students, and the intervention and control will both get the meditation. So the intervention students get the control, get the meditation during the allotted time slot, and the people who are in the control condition then listen to silence for 17 minutes. And then at the end, after we've collected all of the data, then they get the meditation. We use heart rate variability as measured by HeartMath M-Wave software and hardware. And then we followed up with a semi-structured interview protocol to elicit participants' experience with the meditation and also their definitions and experiences of racial trauma. And here's a brief overview of our procedures. So you'll see that if they meet the selection criteria, which include just identifying as Black, not having any heart rate or heart rate variability issues, no medication for heart problems, and then we randomize them into control or racial trauma meditation. And then we walk them through this process in our procedures. So we collect their data at baseline for 5 minutes, expose them to the stimulus for 5 minutes, and then you either receive a meditation or silence for 17 minutes, and we use 5-minute increments to measure their heart rate variability through that. And then finally, there's a 5-minute rest session. We follow that up with a semi-structured interview. It also serves as a debrief. So we ask people what their experience was listening to the meditation, what their experience was listening to the racism, and how they define racial trauma and experiences that relate to that. And then if the person is in a control condition, they'll receive 17 minutes of the meditation following that. And participants are paid $20. So what I think we're seeing right now is some history effect. So we're collecting data from about 26 participants, and to date we've had 8, but recently 2 Black elders were murdered by a white man in Louisville. And we're in Kentucky at UK. So after he first attempted to enter a church, he was unable to get in, and then he went into the Kroger and murdered 2 people. And this has been, I'm not sure if they're going to decide to call it a hate crime, but that's the way we've been experiencing it. So since then, we've had 2 or 3 cancellations, and we hypothesize that this experience, this terroristic act, has impacted recruitment. So in addition to the progress of the study, we're looking to see whether or not this hate crime will also impact results of people who choose to participate afterwards. And we're going to be really mindful of that as we amend our research interview protocol to check for that with participants. And the folks who are doing this research with me, I just wanted to highlight them. So this is my RISE research team over here. These are all my students, and I'm really proud of them. And this is Psychonda. So this is our group at UK. And we are recruiting for radical researchers in counseling, educational, and school psych. So I apologize for the hiccups with the technology, but I do look forward to any questions you guys have.
Thank you so much, Candace. That was amazing. And to your whole team, beautiful work. And sorry for the tech difficulties. You made it through, and we got it. It's a beautiful project and beautiful work. Look forward to seeing the results of that. So for folks who have questions for Candace, feel free to put it in the chat or to hold them until we open it up and you can ask them directly. And now we'll go ahead and hear from Matt Miller.
Okay, can people hear me? Okay. Candace, I'm worried now about my
No.
here, hopefully. Okay. So it's a real privilege to be with you all and to hear about such amazing work. I want to just take a minute and acknowledge this time and the scope of your effort. It's pretty inspiring. I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing that is much smaller in scope. But the kind of inspiration for this, over the last several years, my identity as a researcher has kind of evolved and shifted as I've tried to figure out how I can, as a researcher, really impact social injustice. And I was really faced several years ago, really struggling with an existential dilemma, which was looking at racial injustice and wondering what as a field are we doing to address this in the real world. I've done research papers, but I felt there was a disconnect in my life between some of the research I was doing and the day-to-day lives of people who are being oppressed. that kind of existential dilemma evolved into wondering what academic training programs are doing. But the most discomfort I experienced was asking myself, what am I doing as a researcher, as a citizen, as a human being? What am I doing to address racial injustice in the real world? And so what that eventually turned into was a reshifting of my research program and my overall research aim, and really wanting to commit myself to tangible intervention research. So, several years ago, I started trying to think about developing accessible, ecologically valid in the real world, culturally responsive and evidence-based intervention models for addressing the impact of racism. And just through other kind of life hobbies and experiences, really ended up thinking that perhaps documentary films would serve as an appropriate platform to do this work. And for those of us who are trained in applied psychology and have done clinical work, the fit of filmmaking and this intervention work was a very natural extension of the work that we're doing. It sounds a little cheesy, but I like to think that in a way, filmmakers, therapists, counselors, clients, we are all storytellers in some way. And our work as social justice researchers who are really seeking to disrupt and end racial injustice, it's part of it is crafting an empowering and healing narrative. And so what I'm doing at Maryland with a bunch of my students is we're developing racism intervention videos. And the evidence base of this intervention model, there are several literatures that I could cite, but two of them that aren't often cited, I think, in some of this literature are communication science and Bandura's work. So a few years ago, one of my students brought to my attention some literature in communication science. And this field is essentially dedicated to studying the way in which the manner of presenting a message impacts the effectiveness of that message. So the idea here is that I believe that applied psychologists, counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, school psychologists, that we have important information to share about coping with and healing from racism experiences. And, I was never trained as a researcher how to speak to regular human beings outside of the research world. And so I felt like in my own work, there was a disconnect at times between my research findings and communicating those findings to people in a meaningful way. Communication science tells us that if we can communicate messages to our populations and they can affect attitudes and behavior change in the health domain, and that the way we do that is to craft what are called narrative persuasion arguments, which are for the idea of telling a story in which the protagonist experiences a struggle or a crisis and overcomes that and resolves the crisis. The way in which we can communicate and convince people to move to action, for example, participating in Candace's amazing work, would be through narrative persuasion. And the way in which these narrative persuasion arguments unfold is through this concept called transportation, that the story that you craft becomes much more powerful under a set of conditions. First, when viewers or consumers of the message have an emotional reaction to the story, they feel stirred, they have a tear roll down the cheek. When I watch YouTube clips of Oprah Winfrey or Ellen, there are oftentimes clips that really move me in a way. So emotional connection, identification, when someone hears a story, sees a story, and can identify with the protagonist, that then enhances the message content and its impact. Focus and the feeling of presence or feeling lost. So the idea that while I'm watching this, while I'm hearing the story, I forget about everything else in my life. And when I get lost in the narrative, my troubles go away when I am hearing the story. The more in which these conditions are happening, then the health message, such as seeking social support to cope with racism, these messages have a stronger impact on moving people to action. The other piece here that underlines this program is the social learning and cognitive theory. Essentially, the idea that by seeing other people who I see I can see myself in them. I can identify with them, that I can learn vicariously from them. I can see them as role models, and they can inspire me and motivate me to action. They can provide social support and verbal persuasion that really enhances the belief that I can actually cope with racism. There are other literatures, but these are two of the literatures that really drive this work. And so the intervention model then, essentially, I'm going to show you some still images, but we're creating these very brief video clips, about 3 to 5 minutes, in which a person shares their own experiences of racism. We have to date interviewed over 30 people and have racism experiences spanning from individual, systemic, intersectional, internalized racism. And they're also sharing what has been effective for them and meaningful for them in coping with racism. So we have very nuanced, moving, powerful, horrible stories and experiences of racism, and ways in which people have kind of crafted a narrative and a meaning from them. We have yet to actually collect data for this. I'm going to share data on a similar project that supports this treatment model. But some of the a priori testable hypotheses we have planned are the degree to which this intervention is normalizing and validating experiences of racism, which I believe represents a corrective emotional experience and allows some of that distress to kind of dissipate. The intervention to increase racism coping self-efficacy, or the belief that I can persist in the face of this, that I can survive and thrive despite this, and ultimately reduce the impact of racism-related stress reported. So one of the, it's been a real privilege to do this work, sitting behind a camera and hearing and meeting people and meeting them and learning much more about them. One of the really amazing people we've met and worked with is Shannon, who had sat down with us for about an hour and a half and shared experiences of early institutional racism in school, the unique ways in which gendered racism shapes her beliefs about herself in the academic realm, and her coping through writing and through her connection to Black scholars and writers, and as they write and make meaning of the struggle. And as you're hearing this story in Shannon, I'm not going to show you the clip, but as we are working to actively produce this video now with Shannon, as she is sharing her stories, we are visually depicting some of the affective experiences that Shannon is communicating to us in her story about the impact of racism, how that was internalized for a time, and how she's making meaning and moving through that. And so through this kind of meaning making and coping, there's a real sense of hope and encouragement that was moving to me and my students as we heard this story, and I'm hoping will have an effect. So a couple of years ago, one of my students took the lead on testing the efficacy of this intervention model, not with racism, but with willingness to seek counseling. I had created a brief 3-minute short film or documentary in which a young woman shared her experiences of coping from sexual assault and healing. And what we found in a pilot study finding was that in the experimental condition, higher transportation or connection at the affective level and identification with the protagonist was associated with a greater willingness to seek counseling. And we also found that this video promoted the intention to seek and share information about therapy for those who identified as male participants. So this was a helpful, important efficacy data for us, and we're assuming that our intervention is going to have similar effects. And we have several others. I can't show you pictures from all, but we have a Skylar who's an exceptional scholar and student, a former student from our program, who talked about differential treatment in school, the internalized racism, and the development of a positive racial identity through his advocacy work. And Skylar, his love of art and creativity is really modeled in some of the footage we have of Skylar and some of his advocacy work. And then we have one other one I just want to show you is you might recognize this person, but Kevin Nadal sharing with us the burden. He makes this really excellent point about that it's not isolated incidents, but the accumulation and burden of racism, and the importance of using social support networks and externalizing racism. So that's just a glimpse of what we are doing. I want to stop. I see I'm right over time, so thank you, and I will mute myself.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was an amazing talk, and we look forward to hearing more about this study and the videos. Folks who have questions for Matt, feel free to put it in the chat or hold them until we get through our last presenter. And we're going to hear from Karen Miyamoto.
Della, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Matt, I think we didn't see your slides. And so maybe after Karen's, we can kind of go through your slides real quick. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes? And can you see my screen? Yes, all right. Technology at work. I'm so honored to be invited to this webinar and among these amazing people, and to be invited by Helen, whose work I just am like always wowed by. I want to talk a little bit today in a little different way. I'm actually not going to talk about a particular project. I hope that's okay with those of you who have joined us. I want to talk a little bit about how we understand scholarship, partly because I think, like Matt, I went through a crisis, although I think mine was more developed like over many years in different moments, of kind of really thinking about what scholarship is about and how does it relate to the impact that I want to have in the world, and also about kind of what it means to be a psychologist and what I can bring. And part of this relates to kind of where I ended up, which is, so for the last almost 20 years, I've been in a joint appointment with ethics studies. And that has really meant, initially that was very challenging in some ways, and because it really has demanded that I stretch in particular ways, that I think about how to make connections, that I think differently about epistemology, that I think differently about students, and so that I think really shifted ways of thinking about research or scholarship. Let's see. There I go. So I want to talk a little bit about epistemological questions, because this is kind of where I ended up, how I ended up coming into this, which is, how do we perceive or define what is valuable or valid as scholarship? And like, where do our epistemological ideas come from? You know, in psychology, like, I never really heard the word epistemology, or was invited to question how I know what I know, or what is decided as valid types of knowing. And in ethnic studies, that's a much more robust conversation in my experience, and is accompanied by questions like, whose voice is heard, what questions are asked, why are we asking what we're asking, what kinds of things get like published and what kinds of things don't get published, what's valued and what's not valued, and those types of things. So, you know, this led to my kind of thinking about first challenging or questioning post-positivism as a primary or only approach, and kind of the view that empirical research is the end all and be all. Now, don't get me wrong, I do empirical research. I do both quantitative and qualitative research, and I think that research contributes a lot to our understanding, to dismantling racism, to fostering well-being. So I'm not dissing empirical research, but I am kind of introducing the idea that it's not the only thing that's valuable or that can have impact in scholarship.
Doesn't sound familiar, no.
Also focusing on the complexity of the lived experiences and the way that kind of a more post-positivist approach might not actually be able to to capture the full complexity of a person's experience or a conceptual experience, and that in some ways a post-positivist approach means that we are inherently encouraged to participate in a certain amount of reductionism. And also then thinking a little bit about my goals of amplifying marginalized voices, and whether, and what that means and what kinds of voices and not just marginalized voices, but experiences that don't get talked about, and that because they don't get talked about, that's part of what maintains the kind of ignorance that leads to, or that maintains social injustice. And so in many ways, I kind of came to thinking about my scholarship as centering my goal and the effect of that goal, and less centering kind of like a particular method or a particular approach in the field, which has had some tensions, which I'll talk about a little bit. So this leads me to, what is the meaning of radical healing for me as applied to scholarship? And so if we're thinking about critical consciousness, we're thinking about liberation. In many ways, we're talking about an approach that is challenging the status quo. And for me, that also would include the status quo of our structures of publication, of our ways of thinking about research and scholarship, about kind of ways in which we have been socialized to value certain kinds of knowing or writing or being, and not other kinds. And so over time, I kind of started thinking more about my scholarship in terms of, what is my goal in my scholarship? Like, what am I trying to impact? And then who is the audience? And so in my own work and in working with graduate students and undergraduate students as well, kind of thinking about what outrages you, what injustice do you want to be addressing? And then in what audience and for what purpose? And so on the flip side of being in ethnic studies, I'm a psychologist, I really am. And so there are things that I think we as psychologists can uniquely bring to dialogues and to information and to a range of actions that, because we have an analysis, and not just because we have research ability, but because we have analyses of process, relational process and emotional process, and we have the ability and the training to really think about how emotion comes into the ways in which people take information in, or how socialization shapes particular kinds of attitudes. And then the flip side is, what can we as psychologists learn? So what can we understand or know or need to deepen in the ways that we approach scholarship or research? So I want to talk about some various possibilities. This is a really busy slide. This is the kind of slide that you tell your students, oh, you shouldn't have that much stuff on a slide. But the benefit is, this is a webinar, so it can be up for quite a while, right? So I want to talk about some possibilities that are a little bit different than kind of empirical research, right? And one is about like writing about teaching. And some of this is, there is empirical research about teaching, but there are also articles that are talking about innovative models, and that are writing with students, and that are using student processes as examples, and that are kind of introducing ideas about critical pedagogy. So a lot of this for me has been about bringing a multicultural psychological lens to thinking about teaching, because teachers, and particularly to teaching about race and ethnicity and social justice, because teachers, most college teachers certainly, never get any training about teaching, and teachers, period, don't have psychological training. And so there are things that are happening in their classrooms, and dynamics that are happening between students, and they don't have any understanding of what's going on. And so I actually just came back from the National Women's Studies Association, which was the first time I went to that session. And we did a session on challenging whiteness in the classroom, Roxanne Donovan and Grace Kim and I. And the room was like 40 chairs, and like there were 70 people in the room, and we were a little freaked out, frankly. But this has actually been my continual experience, is that we'll go to, APA or NWSA, and we'll present about teaching, and we're presenting about relational aspects of teaching, or resistance, or emotional titration, stuff that is really central to psychology. And they're always like hugely attended. And so this idea of like, what can we bring through a psychological lens to help people teach this better, to help education be something that challenges the status quo, and that actively promotes healing for our students, but also then in a broader kind of ripple effect. Because education is an intervention. And so if we can use psychological understandings to improve, particularly education, social justice oriented education, I think we are in a much better space. Another type of possibility is writing to affect the methods or conceptualizations or status quo of the discipline, in this case psychology, and of the academy. And so thinking about writing about criticizing checkboxes as methods, for example, or how do we do research better that is more inclusive and has a greater ethics of care for our research participants, so that having to engage in our study doesn't actually reify oppressive categorical approaches or those kinds of things. So I've done some of that writing also, kind of writing that scholarship that really kind of says, so what are we actually doing methodologically? Or writing to expand a narrative to bring in a critical analysis that maybe isn't present in the discipline, for example, to use critical race theory to look at conceptualizations of race in psychology, because we are not often a transdisciplinary approach, or a historically sensitive. And so, other disciplines have a lot to say about how we operationalize race and ethnicity, or how we understand it. The third category I want to talk briefly about is incorporating personal narrative. This is risky because it's personal, and also because psychology doesn't really, as a research science, I mean, it's weird because psychology as a practice, hugely personal narrative. But if you're actually writing about yourself as an author, we don't see a lot of that in our discipline. It's not scientific, or at least that has been my experience. And yet, from a kind of critical analysis point of view, I think there is a question about why should we silence our own voices, and how much are we participating in maintaining a system that wants to silence us as people of color, for example, by not offering our own perspectives on these things. So I have started to write a bit more that includes my own experiences. And so using and now there's nice jargon for it, which makes it more acceptable, because I can talk about it as autoethnography. When I started doing this, I didn't have that jargon. And then people are like, what are you doing talking about yourself? But talking about one's own experiences, one's own background, and really integrating this with an analysis of the group, with an analysis of the theory, with an analysis of prior research. And I think part of this is modeling the ability to take risks in the actual writing, modeling what we would like people to do, modeling the ways that we would like people to engage in a personal level, modeling processes in the text that we would like to foster, modeling difficult dialogues. Because frequently people say, I don't know how to engage in this material across relationships. Like, people tell me I should do this, but what does that look like? Then really briefly, opening space for marginalized voices. People in the academy, I was told, don't do an edited book. Like, you won't get credited for an edited book. But that's a really good way to open doors for people who don't have space, for younger or less well-known people. Right now, I've been kind of working on issues in Palestine, and kind of thinking about whether there are special issues of journals that could open spaces in there. And then finally, writing for the public, and really thinking about which public. So one aspect is blogging, which I know has been talked about more, but also for me, writing, for example, to teachers is one aspect of writing for the public, and really thinking about how do we influence, how do we use the knowledge that we have to influence other people's ways of pushing against the status quo of oppression. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. When you have a moment, you should probably read the chat box because people had some thoughts about your presentation. Since I think, Matt, you had a self-fulfilling prophecy of a technological difficulty, I wanted to invite you to run through whatever slides you might like to run through, since I don't think we were able to see it actually during your presentation.
Yeah, I apologize, everyone. That must have been absolutely horrible to experience that. I'm hoping I'm doing this correctly now. Can you see my screen? Okay. Let's pretend like I did this at the same time as speaking to everyone, but I just wanted to acknowledge some of my student collaborators. This is a moving quote, and I'm just going to walk through this so you can pause the recording later and look at that. But I want to show you some of the actual images that we are working to craft. And again, I was talking about the imagery is part of the message as well. There's music that is playing. The camera is moving, and so we're really invoking some affective responses that makes the health messages much stronger. So I just want to go through all these so that you can, I think you would be able to in the recording, just go back and pause and see individual slides. And sorry about that.
Thank you, Matt. We appreciate that. So I want to thank all of the presenters. You all have had such a wide range of research experiences and projects, and I think that they really have the juices going in people's brains right now. And so I wanted to open up the floor for questions from the participants who are here. I have muted everyone, so if you would like to speak, please unmute yourself and then mute yourself again when you're done. Thank you.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Uh-oh, I hear background. That's just my fellow colleagues next door. So my name is Grishma Shah, and I'm from National Louis University. I'm in downtown Chicago, and what I'm doing, I'm an artist, and what I do is I use film and I use paintings to create dialogue about unconscious biases, specifically for people with disabilities and people with color. And what I've started noticing is that while I make this into my dissertation, the argument that Matt was talking about goes into a lot of inspiration porn. And I want to, academically, inspiration porn is seen a lot in disability films where you have a character going through a crisis, but then you're so inspired by them, and the other characters in the film are so inspired by them that the person becomes more of a miraculous figure rather than a complex human being. And so I want to be mindful of that, and I want to start using the I narrative, but then that's not very scholarly, as I've been told. So I keep having to butt heads with, people that are very scholarly telling me, no, you have to take the I out. And I want to bring the I in because I feel like that's a form of colonialization. We're only allowing people who have the PhDs to further gain information. But what about the public? We want them to understand what's happening too, because that's how you create change. Does anyone have thoughts about how I can actually, make more progress than I'm doing? Because I'm hitting the ceiling and I don't know what to do.
I have some thoughts, and I'm kind of building on what Karen talked about. So are you talking about feedback that you're getting from journal reviewers or people who are in the academy, or are you talking about feedback that you're getting from mentors or advisors? Because those would be different approaches.
Advisors and people from the journal community.
I can speak to the journal community first. where we choose to publish makes a big difference. And your ability to articulate why you're doing something and to provide potentially an evidence base for it, but an explanation for it can make a difference. So I did a collaborative autoethnography for the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and I got pushback on that along the way because it hadn't been something that we were seeing in our field much. And that process through the review comments was, I'm doing this because in education, they're already doing it. In women's studies and Black studies and all of these other areas, this is already scholarship. We're actually behind. And so making the argument that we have some advancement to make as psychologists, and I don't know in your field in art-based research and art-based products, if that's an advancement or if it's something that people are trying to get away from. But that's the type of argument I made to substantiate why this was the time now to do that. For advisors, it's a little bit more tentative, unfortunately so, because of that specific personal power dynamic that you have going on. So who else you put on your committee could make the difference. So if you have one mentor that's really staunchly against it, but you have a few other people who have different positions in the academy or people who are in the community who could say this is credible and trustworthy and valuable to use your eye, then it could give you a basis for one person's vote doesn't make the difference to whether or not you get to advance in your whatever your evaluations are.
No, thank you so much. What I'm starting to see is that I understand from a professional standpoint, we need to be making these innovations, and the scholars and the educators need to understand that. So we need to speak their language. But I'm trying to find like that medium where I speak their language so they understand that advancements are needed, and also the language for everyone else to understand, why this is so important. So thank you so much.
Well, Grishma, your question was related to a question I had jotted down for the speakers. And just to follow up a little bit more is, I'm wondering if any of you have words of advice or additional ideas of how to integrate healing as part of research, in addition to what you've already talked about.
This is Karen, right? I'm not sure, like, all of the pictures. There's a question for me about healing for whom. I think, are we looking at healing for the reader? Are we, directly the person who is reading? Are we looking for healing for communities by trying to shift the ways in which the academy or the practitioners in psychology or the researchers in psychology are doing research or doing practice that might be harmful? Like, are we talking about healing, say, for graduate students or students who are themselves in the research process, so healing within the research process? Because I think that thinking about the healing, the healing from systemic oppression plays out in all of those different areas. So when I think about healing, I think about, like, for me, when I think about healing this way, radical healing, I think about, so there's a system of oppression, because if we think about it in that multiple level, then for me, the answer to the question would be, well, we need to think about it in our methods. We need to think about it in how we describe the people. We need to think about like operationalizing what our demographic variables in ways that aren't about the data, but that are about the people who are taking it. Like taking the survey, for example, if we're doing a survey, if we think about healing graduate students or working with graduate students in a healing way, for me, it's thinking about, like, one of the benefits of kind of like thinking a little more broadly and not going into a kind of large grant-funded research space for me personally has been that I can follow my students as opposed to my students following me into my research area, which has been a wonderful way to learn. And I feel like it has been a piece of empowerment and healing for them, where they get to really explore what they're passionate about and those types of things. You know, I mean, they don't get things from me that they would get from somebody who had their own a more empirical approach. But so I think it's really multi-leveled. Yeah.
I was just going to say that, you know, I really appreciate hearing these different perspectives and questions. And I mean, I think being you know, I was trained as a quantitative researcher and a measurement person, and I still am, but there is it's like a re-socialization to think about applied research, not really, I mean, applied research is, I think, a step in the right direction. That's the paradigm that we have. But I do think that in order to get radical healing from racial injustice and the insidious nature and effect, that you've really got to take risks and do things that are just not the norm. I mean, the three other presenters today just are giving really beautiful, big picture paradigms that I think a lot of people could take and adapt in their own work. You know, my work is much smaller in scope, but I have seen so many colleagues, people like rolling their eyes, like as I'm pushing my cart with a camera and stuff down the hallway, and because I decided that, you know, for my own kind of existential resolution of what do I want to be contributing as a human being in my life. You know, I'm still trying to publish research papers, but you know, I feel like that is something that I almost have to pause every time I think, "Ooh, this could be a good paper that I could do," because you know, I think that is important to work also. But we got to do something radical to address rate. I mean, the amount of people and the severity of impact of racism facing our country and the world, there aren't enough individual or group counselors in the world to kind of make the impact. So how do we get something accessible? How do we get things that are tailored to unique populations, and in a way that is something they're going to consume in the real world? So I'm inspired to hear what others are saying, and yeah. It's a lot of risk taking, and it's easier, honestly, in the academia once you're tenured. But it's risk taking and being innovative in your work.
I would love to jump in because I'm actually a bit in awe. I mean, I literally finished graduate school 20 years ago. It's not a metaphor; it's actually quite concrete. And I so admire the idea of intervening at these one point in time. One of the things that we have learned over the 20 years of parenting intervention with Latinx families is that amount of time, this idea of the treatment package that is 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 15 weeks, you know, that's wonderful for somebody that has a pristine little lab and can bring in people in a pristine little way, but these are not the lives that our families are leading. And, you know, our original RCT went to pot because I made a decision. I believe I was in my 5th year of the tenure track. We're collecting data. There was a raid, and I had to call my program officer because my choices were I could help these families right now, or I can keep the integrity of the study. And I knew what I was going to do, but I called my program officer in advance to let her know what I was going to do. And she said, I can't imagine doing anything else, so go for it. It was an African-American woman. I think having a program officer that was passionate about working in communities of color really helped a lot, right? But we basically dropped what we were doing, and we went and gathered money, and we delivered food, and we delivered diapers, and we did we did guided meditations. Candace, your stuff is so fantastic. The minute I got it, it was years ago, I sent it out to everybody. And there was a willingness. I had a conversation with my research team and said, this could be really the undoing of all of us. This could be the end of my career. It means that you might be out a mentor. I don't know what's going to happen. You don't have to do this with me. And every single person turned around and said, why else are we here? There's no other reason. And so we put the data, we put the research on pause, if you will, to take care of people. And we know we did good. And, I had to write other papers to make sure that my dossier looked like it needed to look like for tenure. And I made choices about being at an institution that had different criteria. So I didn't have to have 50 articles, but I could go up with fewer articles and do this work in a community that was protected. It's really interesting to think about sort of the many decisions that we make at every turn and how we make them collaboratively or not, and how we let our participant, we are part of the community, right? In that radical definition, we are part of the community. We are all healing together. This research is not my research, it's our research. We're learning together. It gets treacherous because it doesn't fit the systems that are in place right now. And in some ways, our experience as academicians parallels the experiences of the individuals or families that we're working with, and wherein their systems are creating the conditions for distress as opposed to necessarily an individual pathology. So one of the big lessons is people don't have time for 12 session packages. It's really hard to accommodate, especially when you have kids that are challenging. And the idea of going with the one session or a really powerful video that you can make time for when it makes sense. I love what you all are doing, and I cannot wait to see more.
Can I add to something that you said, Melanie? And also there's a chat thing going on about the tenure system. I think we are all part of the collective and the community that is healing. And I think we then also have different positionalities and power. And so, like for those of us who have achieved tenure, or those of us who are reviewing articles, which might be across the entire spectrum, like what we bring to those tasks can contribute to that healing. So like we can be the person looking at like Grishma's article and saying, this is amazing that she's using the I and, including the personal voice, or we can be the person that kind of like, criticizes the method because it's not, reaching a statistical kind of approach or whatever it is, right? And similarly, like if we're asked to write a tenure letter, we can kind of go by the numbers and the, impact factors of the journals, or we can tell a much more complicated narrative. And so I think there's also a piece, like I'm so inspired by your story, Melanie, about kind of like saying, no, I'm going to go do this thing that is much more important at this moment, right? And the risks that takes. But wouldn't it be awesome if we could create a world that wasn't a risk, that was the norm?
I want to speak as the untenured person on this panel. I think that that approach of risk-taking and being subversive in the academy is worth it to me. It's just worth it to me. And I let students know that at this moment, that may not be the sacrifice you can make because of all the things that you bring to the table. But for me, the job is not worth my ethic and my value, and I would rather give it up than not be able to do the type of work that I really feel like is important and meaningful. And I frame it like there are different levels of loss that people might experience. You might lose your life doing this work, literally. We have people who have lost their lives doing social justice work. You might lose your livelihood, and your livelihood is your ability to provide resources for the people that you care about or for yourself, including money and food and all of that. And you might lose luxuries. And luxuries might be people don't invite you to brunch anymore, or you get snubbed or slighted for different things. But my bracket level is that at this point, I feel that I'm okay with losing livelihood. And that's a function of all kinds of privilege and grace that I have in my life. So I'm not going to discount that either. But for me, that's where I stand with it. So on the tenure track at the 4th year, that means that if people don't like that I wrote about Black Lives Matter and they're reviewing my dossier, then they can make a decision against me. And that's the decision they have to make and live with. But I felt fine about writing what I wrote. And same for this type of research. Like, maybe people find it valuable and maybe people don't, but the communities that I'm committed to and that I'm a part of do. And so for me, that's all right.
Thank you. It's you know, the theme I'm hearing is that there's got to be meaning to the work that you're doing in whatever format that is, if it's through research or practice. And, you know, Karen, I love what you also said about accessibility, like what kind of public, and we can define that. Like if you want to target teachers as your public because they then influence their students or learners, that's one way. And I have so many things going on in my head right now as a practitioner, thinking like, wow, how can I try to be more accessible? Because I am sitting in this individual therapy room thinking like one at a time. It's a very slow go at it. And I am watching the time, and I think we have at least time for one more question. So if there's anyone else in the participants on the call that would like to ask, please do.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I just want to give a shout out to Helen Neville and her dream team, because honestly, this is part of the radical healing, right? I mean, many of us are connected just really through moments like this that give us just enough fuel to keep going, to hold our breaths that much longer, to get through one lousy review or another tenure process. And, you know, creating spaces like this is a real gift. And I just really wanted to do a shout out to you all for creating that space, because that is no small thing, especially given the struggles of taking risks. So thank you to you guys.
That is so beautiful, Alvin. And I would add to that, if you look at the chat, the skills that the people in this room have in lifting each other up, this is not what I'm used to in academia. This is what I think a lot of us have helped create in our own context. And it's just so powerful to see it happening in front of our very eyes through this chat. I join in the choir of not just congratulations, but thank you, because I feel more healed as I'm walking away from here today.
Any more last comments?
I'm just writing down names for external reviewers. Right?
Well, and absolutely. I think that's what's going on in the chat, is that there is such a community of support and encouragement and real advocacy. I mean, these are the connections and networks we should use, you know, to advance a different way of thinking and pushing. And I appreciate all the voices of the grad students weighing in too, because, you know, I think that's what keeps people going. Especially, you know, the faculty that's doing this work. It's being continuously inspired by students who have ideas, who want to push us to take more risks, because we recognize we have more power in the positions that we're in at this point. And I think it's just a community that we constantly need to support each other, help each other, ask questions. Karen, it's like so many questions. I think everyone's like, you know, our heads are exploding, that we're really inspired, but just all the different ideas and approaches, and, you know, the visibility of everyone putting yourself out there and the work that you're doing. It's so great. And we really appreciate I also want to echo all of the comments of the presenters for you taking the time that, this is totally voluntary. These are, people taking time out of your busy schedules, out of your days to
Wait,
share.
I thought we were getting paid. No?
Yeah, the check's in the mail, Matt. And
That's like a true artist. That's like a true
that's
artist.
a true artist. I'll send you a t-shirt, Matt. Yeah, I do appreciate, and I know everyone appreciates all of the time. There's so many people asking about, oh, does this webinar cost money? And no, it's out of, the graciousness of all the presenters who are here today. We really appreciate you being willing to share your knowledge and to inspire everyone. And I also want to thank my fellow partner, Della Mosley, for helping organize this webinar. Yes, we are recording this, and we will do a little bit of editing, and then we will share a link to the recording for later viewing.
When is the next webinar with similar topics? Would you know?
This is the end of this particular series, but there are regular webinars that the students, student representatives of Division 45, that they post also. So we'll keep that going, hopefully. All right, thank you everyone, and we'll call it a day. Really appreciate all the participation. Great energy.
Thank you all so much. Take care.